Webster, Vancouver. You can help the handicapped of all ages in BC by getting your Kinwin tickets now, and a Merry Christmas to you all.
Webster is next on BCTV.
Good morning. We'd love to know a definite answer to the question, has Prime Minister Trudeau threatened the British Cabinet with pulling out of the Commonwealth if they don't do his bidding on returning the BNA Act, our Constitution, in his particular controversial package? We'll have a chance to nag about that this morning with George Clark, the political correspondent of the Times of London. And for lighter relief later in the programme, we're going to meet a man called Christie. I was going to call him Rennie La Christie, but it's Doug Christie, the Separatist. Big noise in Edmonton, not a very big noise in British Columbia. And for even lighter relief later in the morning, we're going to go head hunting in Nahanni Valley on the Nahanni Trailhead. But first, it's to George Clark, political correspondent of the Times of London, the man who broke the original story about British cabinet ministers speaking out of both sides of their mouths, one thing in public and the other thing in private, about the return of the Canadian Constitution. Clark, after the break. All Canadians know that it's Prime Minister Trudeau's firm determination to have the Constitution back in Canada, wrapped up, tidied and put away by July the 1st of 1981. And if he doesn't get it, he might leave us in a snit. With me this morning is George Clark, the political correspondent of the Times of London. And George, you broke the initial story that is causing all this foo-for-all in Canada over fears or hopes that the British House of Commons will somehow or other block the return of the Trudeau-type constitution. What was that original story that you started the ball rolling with?
Well, it was a story that came to me on the unofficial network, but was confirmed by two cabinet ministers within 48 hours, although they didn't want to be quoted. So I wrote the story, which was simply to the effect that the British government would prefer to have a simple patriation of the Constitution to Canada so that you could get on and do your own work on whatever Bill of Rights or whatever changes in the relationships with between the federal and the provincial governments you wanted to make.
Well, now that was about a month ago, 5 weeks ago. Has the situation, to use my description of it, deteriorated? And is there now a possibility that the British will put up some kind of effective roadblock?
Well, I think that there is now a possibility because the chairman of the Select Committee, Mr. Kershaw, a Conservative, I think he's a former junior minister, has said that the Select Committee at Westminster will widen its scope of inquiry to include representations from Canada. And the interesting thing about that is that he made an original statement saying that on no account would they take evidence from Canada. It was simply to be on the legal relationship of Westminster to alterations carried through under the British North America Act.
Well, they could be nitpicky about that if they wanted to, quite obviously, but have you heard, do you believe any of the threats that allegedly made in some way by Trudeau, that he wants it back as is, no bleeding nonsense? Well, he'll be very angry and might talk about splitting the Commonwealth.
Well, it's pretty clear that his reaction to my story plus a denial from 10 Downing Street, from Mrs Thatcher's office, showed that he was immediately on the blower to see what was going on in London. He had the idea that the thing would just go through on a rubber stamp, whereas this is quite wrong. It has to go through all the processes that an ordinary bill, a United Kingdom bill, has to go through in Parliament.
Well, it starts off in a select standing committee, doesn't it?
No, it starts off with the second reading debate, which is where, for the first time, your Parliament has not had this privilege, where for the first time you can consider the Charter of Rights and the other changes as provisions in a bill, an Act of Parliament, which is to become an Act of Parliament. This has not been open to your MPs in Ottawa.
Don't we know it? In other words, this will still be an Act of Parliament of the United Kingdom Parliament, even when it's sent back to it.
It is indeed. People talk about patriating the Constitution, patriating the British North American Act. It ain't going to happen, because it's a big roll of paper stuffed in the Records Office, and it's got to remain there as a part of our legislation, just the same as this one, if it's passed, will remain at Westminster. It's simply a technicality that Canada will then be on its own and can do its own work for itself without going to Westminster.
Well, you obviously understand it quite closely, because roughly speaking, the new Canadian Constitution, still a British Act, is in three parts. One, the patriation with an amending formula that Trudeau has set without the provincial agreement.
That's right.
Is that a matter of annoyance, do you think, to those who concern themselves with the technicalities?
Well, it is becoming so, because surely in a democracy you need to carry along the provincial governments with you if you're going to make such an important change.
George, Mr. Clark, 100 and how many years? 53 years in a row. You can never get these provincial potentates, these balkanized little men across the country, to use a liberal phrase, to agree on anything. We've got to ask the British to do it.
Well, you're giving Mr. Trudeau his case. He says, unpopular though it is, rejected though it is by 6, probably 7 provinces, we've got to do something about this. In fact, his Minister of Justice said to me the other day, no one likes to go to the dentist, but you feel better afterwards.
All right, take the other side of the coin. Is it correct that what the Canadian government is now doing through Trudeau is going on the bended knee to the British and saying, please pass this act the way I want it. We are the little colony in the country, and we want you to pass our Bill of Rights because we wouldn't dare examine it in the House of Commons here.
Well, I don't think he would agree with that kind of thing, but what he's saying is, please pass this so that we can get rid of all the argument that's going on in the courts of Canada and in the Parliament at Ottawa. I'll just mention one other thing. Because this committee is broadening its scope, as I think from what Mr. Kershaw said, it means that all these provincial governments which are in disagreement with Trudeau will be able to go to Parliament. They will be able to ask people to put in amendments to this Constitution to protect themselves and the British Parliament. I mean, I'm not saying that there'll be many British MPs who are going to take up the cudgels for the provinces, but it's open to them.
Can this drag on for a long time, or is your Parliament nicely scheduled with closure here, there, and the next thing, so that the Select Committee and the second reading and all the rest of it just goes wham bam?
I don't think you could expect that to happen, because here is going to be a measure that's not been properly debated in Canada, and the provincial premiers are having to go to London to make sure that their case is heard.
Okay, you Brits have a very kind of, what's the word, glamorous attitude towards our Indians. Will the fact that they have been in London and set up lobbying offices also influence MPs, or will it just be something that orangutan Labour MP can take from the side and use to beat the Canadian government with?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, in England, because of the predominance of American television, most people think that this side of the Atlantic, the land is populated by 6-shooter cowboys and Red Indians hiding behind rocks.
Surely not.
Well,
still.
But this is it, you see. When they come over with their tribal dress on and they appear before the television cameras, people start to notice. They don't want to know about the amending formula, but if the Red Indians are on the warpath, then everyone sits up and takes notice.
Quoting Queen Victoria and the treaties. More with George Clark, the political correspondent of the Times of London. Soon to disappear, George?
Yes, I'm under notice. I'm under notice of dismissal, and my work finishes hopefully only temporarily on March the 14th, when we hope to form our own company and continue the publication with the workers and the editorial men all having a share in the company.
Possible. We'll
It
talk
is
about
possible.
that later in the programme. George Clark, political car, former colleague of my brother Drew. Is that
That's
correct?
right. Yes, great guy.
After, well, not that good, but nice fella. After the break. George Clark of the Times of London. How much pressure is being put on British MPs, and by whom, though, to foot drag, to drag the feet, to be awkward to Trudeau?
Well, first of all, we mentioned the Indians. That's the Eskimos, the Indians,
Inuits.
and the Métis, the mixed, the half-breed race. And they've done a very effective job, getting plenty of publicity. But in the background is a much more serious problem for Mrs. Thatcher's government and for Parliament. It is that the provincial governments are setting up their little offices and their representatives to lobby MPs so that their point of view, even amendments, can be put in the House of Commons later. For example, Mr. Loisel, representing the Quebec provincial government, has been very active and has cultivated the acquaintance of many MPs simply because he wants to let them know how Quebec feels about it. Now, who's going next? I suggest it'll probably be Alberta.
Right.
It'll probably be Newfoundland. In fact, Mr.
Peckford's
Peckford
in
is there
London.
now.
He's in London now. And
So when that happens, the British government has to realise that they're trapped, A, by history, B, by the procedure of the House.
Trudeau told me not 2-3 weeks ago, when I put it to him directly, I said, what are you going to do if the British drag their feet in this, the House of Commons?
Yeah.
And he says, I have Mrs. Thatcher's assurance of a 3-line whip, and therefore I'm quite confident the matter will be dealt with expeditiously, or once to that effect. What does a 3-line whip mean?
Well, it means that she can muster her majority, an undoubted majority, there's no doubt about that.
She's got a clean, clear majority.
Yeah, she can do it. She can bulldoze it through, but I'm not so sure that she'll want to use the guillotine on it. Every MP has the right to speak and to propose amendments to this constitution when it comes to the committee stage. This is where Mr. Trudeau is probably overlooking the power of an ordinary backbench MP at Westminster.
Even that Labour guy who's always being quoted, I forget his name now.
Bruce George.
Bruce George.
Yes.
He can hold it up for as long as he more or less wishes.
He's a great campaigner for civil rights, wherever Indigenous people, as he thinks, are held down wherever they are in the world.
Select committee first and then second reading?
No, the Select Committee at the moment is merely going into the legal relationship of Parliament to amendments on the British North America Act.
Fair enough.
Once he extends the evidence to Canada, to provinces, then we know that the provinces will be able to come and lobby when the bill itself comes over. We haven't got it yet. It's got to come from Ottawa, and it looks as though there's trouble there as well.
Yes, they're now, Chrétien, your friend, the Justice Minister, is now talking about being accessible to amendments in some of the aspects of the present draft Bill of Rights.
Well, Ted Broadbent, the New Democratic Party leader, said that he's convinced that next week, before the Joint Committee, he will be able, in agreement with Mr. Trudeau, he will be able to bring in an amendment which will deal with the resources problem, which will put millions and millions of pounds into the pockets of the provincial governments who are complaining.
Particularly his friends in Saskatchewan who had to be pissed off. You met Blakeney. What did you think of him?
I thought he was a great guy, and he put it into perspective. He commented on the fact that Mr. Trudeau had said that the Separatists were hysterical, and he didn't like that at all. He said there may be some in Western Canada who could be described as hysterical. But if Mr. Trudeau thinks this is the action of a lunatic fringe, it's a complete misreading of the situation.
True.
He said it would not take very much to get a substantial body of respectable support for the separation of Western Canada. He said
That's what he told you.
Yes, yes, he
Will that
was
be
on
in
the record.
Will that be in the Times today?
I phoned it at 3 o'clock this morning.
Give me that
and I
quote
was
again.
still awake. I'll give you it again.
Give me it again. That's good.
He said that there may be some in Western Canada who might be described as hysterical. But if Mr. Trudeau's remark indicates that he thinks this is the action of a lunatic fringe, it is a complete misreading of the situation. It would not take very much to get a substantial body of, quote, respectable, close quote, support for the separation of Western Canada.
Well, I'm afraid... Go on.
Just a minute. He said the feeling of alienation had grown rapidly in the last 4 months, and probably 15 to 25% of the people in Saskatchewan would favour separation now. Now that, for me, was quite a shock. I didn't realise that here is a serious politician, a premier, who, making his own assessment, says that it is a serious movement.
And the other thing is that it comes from a very serious, reasonable, skilled premier, probably
Indeed.
the best premier in the country at the moment.
Indeed. And Claude Ryan, another man who I found very, very sensible in his approach, he said that he regretted that Westminster were being brought into this argument, a domestic quarrel, but he thought that the proposals would never reach Westminster in the form they're in now.
George, what could be done? Could the British say, look, we're not going to pass this Bill of Rights. We're just going to give you back your act, goodbye, and God bless you. Could they do that?
They could, and this is the dilemma for Mrs. Thatcher, because if she goes ahead with what Mr. Trudeau wants, and what she has declared is the Tory party position, which is to just shove it through, use the majority, get it passed, right? Mm-hmm. That has pleased one section of Canada, Mr. Trudeau and his boys up at Ottawa. But what about the provinces who still feel aggrieved and worried about what London has done? We can't win.
Oh, you can't win, but they don't really matter to you. What do a bunch of provincial premiers matter to you?
I'm sorry, but our queen is their queen, and a lot of people over here have told me that they very much regret that the position of the Queen of Canada.
Have you had the view in Canada yet that the Bill of Rights is the first step by Trudeau towards a U.S. constitutional type republic?
That's true. I've heard that said. Yes.
That would worry the
I
British.
mean, yes. I think that there is the element of desire for centralised control, increasing the power of the federal government over the provinces in a way that no one ever dreamed of.
Well, it's a question of how right is he and how wrong is he, because this country could finish up as 10 balkanized states with no central government.
Well, it looks to me from what Mr. Blakeney said yesterday that this idea of a separate state, still within the Commonwealth, consisting of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, it's not so unreal as I thought.
But yet we've always got the ever-present problem that there are many, many separatists in the province of Quebec, but the referendum went down the drain.
Yeah. Why should the British Parliament get involved in this? It gets involved because there are signs coming now that this great country could be splitting apart.
Well, of course, Western separatism would lead to a regrowth of Quebec separatism, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would indeed.
George, I'm going to take some phone calls to you this morning on the Constitution, on the British attitude to the Constitution. And what I would like to hear is whether or not you think the British have any right to interfere with it at all, or if they should just send it back, holus bolus, all in one big bundle from Britain. The BNA Act as Trudeau wants it. We'll take some phone calls on that topic, only on that topic, now, after the break. George Clark is the political correspondent of the Times of London. And just before we get the phone calls, you're on your redundancy or dismissal notice as
That's
the
right.
Times of London is being
Shut down.
by Lord Ken Thompson.
Well, it is Lord Thompson's company which is closing down. This is due to prolonged industrial trouble. You remember we closed down for 11 months just 2 years ago, and the unions there have not been very cooperative.
How can
with his
you hope
efforts.
to set up a new company with the same unions?
Well, we shall be setting up, we hope, a company that will not rely on hot metal. That's what we still use in dear old England, but using computer photo typesetting.
Yeah,
That's much cheaper.
VDTs and all the rest of it.
Yeah, that's right, sir.
But the unions in Britain will fight that to death. You can't even use...
We could have trouble, that's true.
I mean, I was over trying to do some television and I found that you couldn't even use videotape.
Really?
Except in one television network, the Grampian network, away up in the Highlands.
I see. Oh, well,
Had
there.
to use film.
Free and easy up there.
Anyway, you hope to do this by the spring of this year?
We do. We hope that we can carry on without any break in publication.
Government grant?
No. We would set our face against that kind of finance. We hope to raise money in a consortium of business interests, insurance funds,
You could probably raise
institutions.
it from all over the world, too.
Well, I'm going to Alberta tomorrow. I hope to have a word with some of the oil barons there.
Get your
That's
hands
just, I
in,
better not say any more.
get your hands in a few billions of the Heritage Fund. Go ahead, please, directly on your point to George Clark.
Yes, well, I have lots of points, but I really resent Mr. Clark being here interfering in, and I do consider it a Canadian affair. I think, too, that it's kind of a bit much to hear Britain talk about, worried about the Canadian Indians when they haven't done anything at all for the Canadian Indians at any time. And also, I also resent Premier Bennett. I mean, if opening up and going to London, when he didn't even go before his local legislature. Before he went, he didn't have anything debated on this, whether or not he would go to Britain.
Nor did he appear in front of our special committee.
The other point I'd like to make is, has there ever been, is all the bills treated the way that Britain now wants to treat the Canadian Constitution Act? Are all bills treated that way, and is there any precedent? Has there ever been a bill rejected by them?
No, there's never been a bill rejected. And I want to come back on your point that I'm interfering, interfering in Canadian politics. It's not true. The Canadians themselves, when they refused to go along with the Treaty of Westminster in 1931, made an exception. They didn't want to be an independent country making their own constitution, as other members of the Commonwealth did. No, they wanted still to go to Mother Parliament in London to get their changes in the Constitution agreed. It has been a convention that we always approve what comes from the federal government. That is the established convention and practice. But when you have 6 provincial governments, possibly a 7th, if Mr. Blakeney doesn't get what he wants about referenda and so on, then the British Parliament has to decide it's got to take more serious notice of it.
Well, you've never done anything before. You've never interfered, or you've never concerned
No,
about the
that's
provinces
not
before.
true.
Hold
I
on.
didn't hear you speak up with concern about Quebec, worried about whether or not they were being fairly treated when treated fair when they were worried about pulling out of Canada. And I just think it's going to be a backlash on Britain, because I really resent it.
Well, I resent it too. I served in the Navy for 7 years and went through some very bad episodes with Canadian sailors and officers, some of them dying quite near to where I was. So I have a very serious concern.
Well, it's good to know Britain has so few problems that she has to worry about Canada. Goodbye.
But wait a minute, just on this point.
Yeah, sure.
She made a very good point that she wanted to know if this had happened before.
Yeah.
Well, of course it did happen before. In 1949, Newfoundland, which had been administered as a crown colony or dominion on its own, wanted to join Canada. So we had a bill in Parliament. It went through all its stages, just the same as this one will. And A.P. Herbert, my late friend, a very good humorist, led the opposition in the House of Commons on behalf of the people of Newfoundland, who he said had not been properly consulted.
That's correct. Only passed by 51% or something.
Well,
but you raised another very important point, in which I appear to have been conned. In the preamble to the new Canadian Constitution, it says, and whereas it is in accord with the status of Canada as an independent state, that Canadian so-and-so. You say the Treaty of Westminster in 1931, Canada refused the opportunity to write its own constitution then.
It refused to take the same kind of freedom, independence that went to
Australia.
other countries of the Commonwealth. Why did they do that? Because again, there was this desire for the provinces to have some kind of consultation.
Next call. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
That's you. Speak up.
Yeah, I'm have to speak up in defense of your last caller. I'd be very upset if Britain didn't pass this without very much debate at all. It's a decision of the only government in Canada that's been elected by all Canadians, a representative of everybody across Canada.
He's a Liberal.
The Liberal government of Canada, which I might point out the fact that the Conservatives don't represent Western Canada. They're a minority. the NDP receives something like 22 or 23%, and the Conservatives, the
You're
Liberals
into
receive another 23, 24,
You're
25%.
you're into semantics now. The Conservatives are properly elected, and there are only 2 Liberals elected to the west of the Lakehead, and the fact remains is that we are represented by Conservatives and NDPs in the Parliament in Ottawa. No point in trying to kid yourself that we're not represented. We are.
We're represented all right. What's your beef? If we are not represented the government of Canada, that's because we didn't vote Liberal. That's not an argument. We're all Canadians.
Anyway, I've got your message. You'd be very offended if the British House of Commons dragged its feet.
I would be.
Thank you, sir. Salmon Arm, go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, from Salmon Arm. Go ahead.
I'd like to just say that I don't think the British Parliament should interfere with the bill at all. And how can Premier Bennett take a point of view when he doesn't really know what the people think? Why doesn't he take a referendum?
She's saying, why shouldn't Bennett take a referendum? Well,
Yes.
we don't govern by referendum.
No, could I just come back on this, the other caller saying that Britain should not interfere in this? It is obvious that if it had come over to London in a simple form, the patriation of the Constitution, with an amending formula, it would have been easy to get it through. Mrs. Thatcher would have simply nodded and it would have gone through all its stages in Parliament without any bother. I'm sure of it. We don't want to know about your problems. We think you're a grown-up country that can manage its own affairs. Why should you come to Westminster? This is the attitude. We're not wanting to interfere in your affairs, for goodness sake.
What you're saying is that Trudeau's tactics have given the British, or those who wish in the House of Commons, an opportunity to interfere.
I think that is the implication, because if you've got 6, possibly 7 provincial governments still feeling aggrieved, still wanting a change, surely that is a different position from changing the regulations for unemployment pay or something of that sort.
Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, I am completely on the side of George Clark. I think the British government does have a right to step in.
Thank goodness.
Go on, carry on.
Well, I think, like most Canadians, still respect the Queen, and, she has this right. And as far as, our provinces and everybody, nobody is totally agreed.
Good, thanks, ma'am. Go ahead, please. Oh, take a break. I'm going to do another segment of telephone calls with George Clark after the break. George Clark is the parliamentary correspondent of the Times of London. Aren't you glad that you have a unitary state so far in the United Kingdom? You can see what happens once you balkanize it?
Yes, I think if I express my own view, it would be that we are lucky not to have to operate on 2 levels. That's the problem in Canada. I've only been here 10 days and I can't claim to be an expert, but what hits me right between the eyes is the fact that your political parties operating on the federal level can be quite different in their attitude to policies like the Constitution.
You're dead on at the provincial
with the
level.
provincial level.
We have more civil servants than we have people in this country.
That's not true, is it?
Damn close to it.
You're pulling my leg.
No, I ain't. Go ahead, please, to George Clark.
Yes, I want to concur with most of the callers in that I'm certainly not a Liberal, but the Liberal government that's in power right now is duly elected in Canada, and this is our government. And I don't think Britain should even be seen to not be trying to interfere. It's not a question whether they have a right or not. It's whether they would be seen to. And most of these provincial governments didn't even want to be bothered with the Constitution. They said it wasn't important. The people didn't care about it. There were all other sorts of problems that were more important, and if you don't set a time limit on these sorts of things, they never get done. We've been trying for 50 years to have it done.
You see, Trudeau was on the spot. Promises were made by all of the provinces and all of the people of Canada to the province of Quebec.
Yes.
To change the Constitution, to have
Yeah,
minority language rights, etc. And he is very properly attempting to carry out his province. And now he runs into this backlash.
I think that he's a very courageous man. What's more, from all I've heard of his activities, he's a very astute politician.
True.
Unfortunately, when we were in Ottawa, he was prospecting for oil in Saudi Arabia, so we didn't get to see him. But I do admire his courage. And I can see the dilemma that people are in. We're in the dilemma in London. The provincial government surely have some powers. They must be taken notice of.
When your story from Blakeney gets in the Times of London today, that'll come rattling back to this country again.
Well, it's freedom of information,
You're
isn't
nothing but a troublemaker, George Clark.
Oh, come off it. I just report the facts. I'm a reporter. I'm not a commentator.
That's what I was trying to tell to that woman who accused you of interfering. You're not interfering, you're reporting.
That's the facts.
You're almost as old as I am.
Come off it. Get on with it.
Go ahead, please.
Yes? Hello.
Go ahead. That's you, ma'am.
Yes. Mr. Webster, I don't want to nitpick, but why do we keep using the word patriation? There ain't such a word in the English dictionary.
Well, let's call it repatriation.
It's repatriation.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd just like to make a point with regard to some of your previous callers. I think you might be doing the citizens of British Columbia a great public service by taking a page out of the public broadcasting system's philosophy and educating the public. If you and maybe some journalists in this province would get it together enough to give a crash course in the process of parliamentary democracy here and in Britain, especially in Britain, it might be able to clear up a few misconceptions that some people have in this part of the country.
Well, that would be kind of dull to do.
This pseudo-intellectual sort of atmosphere, you know, these people would call up and they say, you know, they have this attitude that the Queen is the supreme be-all and end-all.
They don't call up here and say that.
Well, I get the impression from the first caller especially that that was her attitude. I mean, when are people going to understand that the Queen actually doesn't really play a vital role at all? I mean, as far as the parliamentary process in Britain, I mean, they have a moral and legal responsibility.
Same here. It's exactly the same relationship.
It is, yes.
Go ahead, please.
Hello?
That's you, ma'am.
Hello?
That's you, ma'am.
Yes?
Yes.
Is that Mr. Webster?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, well, I would like to tell you that I am in favor of Britain holding up on repatriating the BNA Act.
Good. Why?
Pardon me?
Why?
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 Why? Well, I'm very much afraid of what Mr. Trudeau will do if he has complete power. And I don't believe that it's being brought back democratically. We don't have any representation from the West, and there are a majority of provinces that are against the repatriation.
Yeah, you see, there's one particular kicker. Hold on a second, ma'am. There's one particular kicker which frightens the West very much, and you'll know about it. And that is that under his amending formula, for all time to come, regardless of what proportion of the population Ontario and Quebec has, they will have the right of veto of change.
Yes, yes. I've appreciated that.
And that's fearsome to the West.
And there is also, as I understand it, the power to hold a referendum over the heads of the provincial governments to change a law which could affect their interest very considerably, especially raw materials and resources. Yeah.
It's very unclear at the moment, but it seems to give them the power after a 2-year deadlock to run referenda as they wish, financed and questioned as they wish.
That's the point.
And as you know, in today's media, with all the money you can buy, you could pass anything.
Yes, yes.
Go ahead, please.
Hello?
That's you, sir.
Yes, thank you very much.
Do go ahead.
I don't think there would be any objection from anyone if it was straight patriation. But the fact that they want amendments in it before patriation is what people object to. And under Trudeau's plan, Ontario and Quebec will have a veto forever because at the present moment they have 25% or more of the Canadian population.
Correct, sir.
If in the future the population of some other province exceeds that of, let's say, Ontario, then they will still have a veto, and we will never be able to change that.
Good,
and I think anyone in this BC or Alberta or the West at all who are going to accept what Trudeau wants now just don't know the facts. They're speaking from complete ignorance.
Are you impressed by the knowledge of the callers?
Well, I was very impressed by an earlier caller who said that it might be an idea to give Canadians a short course on parliamentary procedure, because they would then see how very different is the Westminster procedure from the procedure being followed in Ottawa. I'm quite amazed that this elaborate constitution has gone to a joint committee, is going to come back from that committee with various amendments written in or proposed. You get the original draft and then you get the new draft, and yet there appears to be no possibility for the members of the Assembly to actually debate that or seek to amend the amendments, which is what you can do in Westminster.
What you're saying is that
which is democracy.
all we're doing is we're preparing some amendments on the Trudeau formula, which will then be mailed or couriered to London. There it will be passed, and there will be no debate in the House of Commons of what will be the Canadian Constitution.
No, that's
in
not
our
so.
House of Commons.
No, that's
in
not.
our House of Commons.
No, you haven't got the point. There is apparently no precedent for a Bill of Rights incorporated in a constitution in Canada.
None.
As it is now. What the opposition parties told us in Ottawa was that they still haven't decided on the method, the procedure, whereby the House of Commons and the Senate will be able to look at these amendments and possibly change them before the thing goes to London. Now that amazes me.
He's bringing it back on December the 9th, the report from a special committee.
Yes.
It will not be an act of the Canadian House of Commons. It will be a motion to amend the document which is going to go to London.
Correct.
And there will be no proper debate or opportunity to amend that act.
Well, I'm baffled by that. I think if there is no precedent for a bill of this kind, then all parties should get together and agree on a method of looking at what the committee sends back.
That's our problem. Nobody can agree on anything, federally or provincially.
Well, you'll have to leave it to London then, won't you? And all these viewers who say that we should have no part in it, they've got to realise that it was the act of the Canadians themselves in 1931 that kept this rather archaic procedure going.
That was something new. I understood that we had become a truly and totally independent nation in 1931 by the Statute of Westminster.
If you had, why do you have to go to Westminster under the British North American Act, sir?
And if we had, why didn't we write a constitution in Canada in 1931?
Right. You've answered the question. You have still preserved a kind of vestigial colonial relationship. And we don't, well, I'm speaking for myself, I'm just a reporter, but I just don't want to get tied up in these Canadian arguments. We have big problems in the United Kingdom. We have a terrific rate of unemployment. We have industries shutting down. We have my own paper shutting down. And we have problems in the Labour Party where they've chosen a new leader. They're in a state of flux and dispute at the moment. There's a lot of stuff to report in London without coming on to the oil problems of
well, you must
Alberta.
admit, we only get publicity on either big constitutional crisis or Trudeau sliding down banisters in London.
And I'm very sorry that that is the case, sir. But this
George,
is what we're living with.
I can't resist it. The Americans have just elected a 69-year-old film actor. And you, as the leader of your Labour Party, have got a 67-year-old dilettante. Can he win the next election?
I think he could, yes, if he goes out for his walks on Hampstead Heath and keeps fit and exercises the dog like you do every morning, eh?
How about Maggie? Is she still the Iron Maiden?
Oh yes, she is still the Iron Maiden, and she is going to stick to her policies, and we hope sincerely that they will succeed.
Just a minute before you go. No, Doug, come on over. Just walk over. I want you to meet the real live Western Canadian separatist, so-called.
How do you do, sir? Pleased to meet you.
You can see the hands anyway. This is Doug Christie of a very strange organisation called the Western Canada Concept. He's trying to pretend he's not a separatist, but I'll deal with him separately.
Well, thank you very much.
Sit there for a moment, George. Don't go away, and I'll now interview Doug Christie.
Can I sit here and take notes?
Please feel free.
Right. Okay.
After the break. We have a number of so-called separatist, or in fact separatist organizations in Western Canada. The West Fed Association, its principal advocate here is an out-of-work PR man, and he's backed by oil money from Calgary. Then we've got the Western National Association. Realtor, a 54-year-old realtor, claims lots of members. I remember when they tried to get a politician to run as their frontman a couple of years ago, and he wanted $100,000 up front. And then we have the Western Canada Separatist Party, going under the disguised name, for some strange reason, of the Western Canada Concept. Doug Christie, Victoria lawyer, who was hazarded to the roof by 2,700 people in, where was it, Edmonton?
Edmonton.
Edmonton. and has come back convinced that he's going to be the charismatic leader to smash this country. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I think you're wrong in many scores, Jack, but you're always entertaining, so I'll just let you carry on.
Tell me something.
Tell
Are you a
tell you
separatist?
what.
Let's
I
put
believe
it
in the independence of Western Canada, and I'm probably one of the only people who has, for the last 5 years, maintained this same position.
At the time when you could hold a meeting of your organization in the telephone booth.
As Bryce Mackesy said, that was his suggestion, but it wasn't true. We've always had considerable support, and more now because people realize. After the last election, one Liberal west of the Red River demonstrates that we don't count politically. The budget demonstrates that Alberta can be singled out for an unusual attack. And the constitutional proposals indicate a veto forever for Quebec and Ontario, and they also indicate equalization payments forever and entrenching the French language forever, all of which was never approved of by us in the West. I think it's about time we had a choice, Jack.
It was. The entrenching of the language was approved by all political parties in the House of Commons, except for a rump group of MPs, Tory MPs.
Well, you're talking about the Official Languages Act.
The Official Languages Act was the basic concept of the entrenchment, now being delivered in a kind of milk and water way in Trudeau's Constitution.
Well, that's a different situation. The Parliament of Canada passed a bill called the Official Languages Act, but they could undo that tomorrow. But when Trudeau puts it in the Constitution as inherently the right of every Canadian all across the country, it's a very different thing. And it means that if it's to be changed, Quebec must approve. And I don't think the West understands the implications of that. Trial in the French language, do you know what that means?
Yes, trial in the French language means that a Canadian with basic language as French would have a trial in French, whatever reasonable
and possible.
Oh, yes,
a French judge, a French jury, a French prosecutor, a French clerk, French-speaking
How would
everybody.
you like it if it were the other way around?
If I was in Quebec, I would expect to speak French. And if they're in the rest of Canada, they should speak English.
You're a bit of a bigot, aren't you?
Oh, I object to that, Jack. It's been used too many times. And
No,
very shallow description.
Surely
Is James Richardson a bigot?
I would say he's very close to it.
Is that right? Well, you throw the word around rather loosely.
No, with the worst will in the world, I say that with my worst will in the world towards Trudeau, I would say that it's so cleverly written that there still is an area which would be decided by the courts where it was usable or not.
I don't know if that's the case, especially when they're all federally appointed courts.
Okay, Doug, let's start again. Tell me in simple language why I should become a separatist and what it would mean to me.
Well, it would mean that we could double pensions and double social benefits without increasing tax by keeping the resource revenues in the land from which the resources come.
Okay, let me stop right there. We could double pensions, we could double social security, because we would no longer share any of our newfound wealth with the rest of the country.
It's not newfound, it's newly developed. Yes, that's correct. And why we shouldn't share is because it's going down like sand down a rat hole to the federal deficit, which is growing by leaps and bounds and is only kept in line by exploiting Western exhaustible resources.
All right, what was in the budget that's going to make me unhappy? I'm really quite pleased when I see Trudeau Lalonde, who is the real architect, saying...
Arch-villain.
Arch-villain, I don't care, was saying that we are going to Canadianize some of these multinational oil companies who will rip us off forever.
No, sir, the oil companies are not ripping us off. They're getting a small percentage in comparison to what the governments take. And I hope you realize that the price of a gallon of gasoline is 65% government tax. The rest is the profit, allegedly, of an oil company who takes the risk and invests the money.
What is the share of a barrel of gasoline?
Where would the oil be if the oil companies hadn't developed the resource?
Agreed entirely. I'm all for free enterprise up to a point. 45 cents to the provincial government.
Well,
correct?
There's disputes over those figures, but I think you're right.
33 cents to the 45 to feds, 33 cents to provincial, and 22 to the feds. That's it, isn't it?
No, I think that the last figure is, if I'm understanding it correctly, is to the oil company.
No. It's 45 to the provincial government, 33 to the oil companies, and 22 to the feds.
Well, I have different figures, but
your figures are wrong. But that's beside the point.
All right.
That's quite beside the point. You're telling me that I can have double pensions, double social benefits, if we keep all the wealth in the 4 western provinces.
In the land from which the resources come, the revenues should remain.
Has Canada not, and I say this in a nice way, has Western Canada never received, in the bad old days, any benefits from the central treasuries?
No.
No?
No. The Blackman
Not
report...
the crow's nest freight rates?
That's got nothing to do with intergovernmental transfers of funds. In fact, it's more expensive to ship manufactured goods from the west to to the east than it is from the east to the west. That keeps Ontario and Quebec happy, liberal, and federal.
Okay, what else? Come on now. How are we going to do this separation? Are we going
We'll
to
have a referendum in each province. We don't think that necessarily separation will be accomplished. Just give the people of British Columbia and Alberta and Saskatchewan a choice before we're inflicted forever with a federal Trudeau liberal constitution that we never chose and never elected the government to give us.
You are a long-time born Canadian of some generations.
Several, yes. My great-grandfather fought in the Fenian raids. He was given a farm in Ontario for having defended Canada. My grandfather fought in the First World War in the trenches. My father fought in the Second World War. He was a tail gunner in the RCAF.
And yet, in a cold-blooded, crassly materialist
Not at all. No.
interpretation, you say money talks, let's split the country.
No, it's not a matter of money. It's a matter of self-government and pride. And we in the West have never had a right to have influence in the government of Canada. And it's about time we were given an opportunity to decide whether we want that forever or not.
Let's say that again. We in the West have never had a right to influence the government in Ottawa. Have I got it correctly?
Well, I think the record should speak for itself. I've said it.
Don't we have a free parliamentary
We have 78 seats in Western
elections?
Canada, 95 from Ontario and 75 from Quebec. And you know, the last election was decided before they even counted a vote west of the Lakehead.
Don't I know it? I was on
And
the
consequently,
television.
why do we bother voting? Why do our MPs go to Ottawa? They should come home and work for a living and get off their index pensions. The only reason they stay there and babble in Ottawa is primarily to keep themselves in a job. And I think it's a disgrace that they pretend they can speak for Western Canada.
All right, to put your case even more clearly for you, what you object to with the redistribution of population to the West.
Demographic surveys indicate the population's not coming to the West. The front end of the vacuum cleaner's coming west.
Yeah, well, fair enough, that's a good line. But what you object to is the fact that Quebec and Ontario, with their preponderance of seats and votes, have always run this country.
That's right. For the last 100 years, we had no regional representation. If we had a regionally elected Senate in the beginning, we wouldn't have had the Mirabel Airport, the World's Fair, the Olympic Games, bilingualism, handouts to Ford and Chrysler Motor Corporation, protective tariffs for Algoma Steel and Sault Ste. Marie, and 100 other things that have been unjust to the West. And I don't think you even begin to cope with the problem when you call us bigots.
Many of these particular aspects you're right on. But what I don't understand about you, Doug, in all sincerity, and not being abrasive and nasty, is that for the sake of adjustments, you're prepared to split the country.
There's no way that adjustments will be made. The government is very close to ramming a constitution down our throat. We have no power for the next 4 years to do anything. Peter Lougheed, all he can do is boycott the constitutional talks because he knows that it's totally unjust from the beginning and they can't win.
Except that you get, you and other separatists get no aid and comfort from Lougheed.
Well, what can he do? His hands are tied.
Why are they tied?
Because he's outnumbered federally, and he has no hope in the court process.
So therefore, he's willing, you would interpret, to take his lumps at the wrong end of a federal state, but he's not prepared to go separatist.
Well, that's his decision, and
Nor is Bennett.
Well, he's going to have to listen to the people.
Can you
and
name
we're going
me
to try to educate the people as to what's
How many
really
members
going
do you
on.
have now?
I don't count them, Jack. How many do the Liberals have? I'm well aware of
They could
many
produce
thousands.
cards, but you're aware of thousands of adherents?
That's right.
1,000?
More than that.
10,000?
I don't know.
How many did you get out to your last public meeting in Vancouver? 50?
We never invited anybody. That was an academic seminar, and I found it amusing that the province decided that it was a meeting of ours. I was asked to speak at some academic seminar, and all of a sudden they say it's a separatist meeting. It turned out that I convinced most of the crowd, who happened to be there, 50 people, not because we invited them, because they were there.
Doug, you're still doing your legal practice.
I'm trying to survive, like a lot of other people.
Do you find that people turn away from you now that you've really stated your case bluntly?
I'm
as a
prepared,
spectator?
always have been, Jack, to pay the price for my principles.
Doug Christie, Western Canada, what's it called?
Concept. Birth. New birth.
Western Canada Conception.
Well, you can call it if you like, but its name is Concept. An idea.
An idea.
Whose time has come.
Separatist idea.
Self-determination.
Separatist.
Independence.
Separatist.
Call it whatever you like, Jack.
But you say separatist. It's easier to understand.
If you wish to call it separatist, then you may do so.
You don't want it.
I call it justice.
Separatist justice.
Well, self-determination.
How
How
much would you pay for your share of the national institutions?
A per capita portion.
After the break. The target for the telephone calls has changed. I don't know if the phone calls have changed, but I now expect you to address yourself to Doug Christie of the Western Canada Concept. keep thinking of birth control pills. Have I any calls for Dougie? Gladys? Go ahead to Doug Christie.
Oh, yes.
What do you make of him?
Well, I have a question to ask about what would his stand be in the case of defense? Would he take a separatist stand?
Would you fight for Canada, he's telling you?
I would certainly be prepared to say that Western Canada will have a viable defense force, far better than the Canadian government today is providing for Canada as a whole. We'll be good allies with the United States and members of NATO and NORAD. I think that's what we would want.
Don't you think there's a grave danger if we ever, God forbid, did split up east to west in some way?
Don't cut me off, Jack.
No, I'm not going to cut you off. That we'd be swallowed up between here and Alaska by the United States?
I have no fear of the United States taking any force against us, and I don't think they would desire to do anything else either. I think we'd be good friends, and I think good free trading partners, but we don't want their form of government any more than we do Ottawa's domination.
Okay, go ahead, caller.
Well, no, as far as, I would, first of all, I recommend he not be the captain of my infantry if I was a private. But in terms of defense, his stand is absolutely ridiculous. You know, we've got to come together somewhere.
Thank you very much. Go ahead to Doug Christie.
Oh, good morning, Mr. Webster. This question, I have a question and a point for Mr. Christie. The first one is, speaking in terms of an Albertan, because that is where I'm from, when Quebec wanted to separate from the rest of Canada, they wanted to share a common dollar and a common economy with the rest of Canada. In a sense, isn't that what Alberta has done already, and they're just not telling any of the other provinces? So I guess they have separated. And the second point is, if Alberta and Western separatism actually did take place, isn't it a more serious question? It's not a breakup of Western Canada, but wouldn't that actually split Canada into 4 separate pieces? Western Canada, Ontario, Quebec, and the eastern provinces?
I think that's probably an accurate assessment of what would happen if Alberta chose independence. We're saying that each province should have the right to choose because never before have they been asked whether they want to be part of Canada or not.
But you can't just take a nation which has been 100 and odd years and suddenly say, do you want to split up?
Well, it wasn't created by God, Jack. It was created by men. There isn't a single reference to any divine purpose for Canada.
I get kind of sick and tired of this business of provincial rights, because if we don't have I don't mean all the little things, but if we don't have a central government, we don't have a country.
Well, unless we had a ratification of this central government by the people of the various regions, then how can it be right and fair and just?
Because it's been there for 100 odd years.
And it's never worked fairly for the West. Since 1870 or 1885, there's always been grievance in the West.
Things are a hell of a lot better now than they were even when I came here in 47.
A lot worse for the West.
Go ahead, please. Hello, where are you?
Yes, I'm here. Mr. Christie, with you 100%.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead, please. Go on, you're next. I was too quick in them, I thought.
I suppose.
Didn't mean to be.
That's all right.
Go ahead, please.
Hello?
That's you, sir. That's you.
Yes, is it me?
Uh-huh.
Hello? Is that Mr. Christie?
Hello, how are you this morning?
Fine. Doug Christie, I want to know why you want to change the name to call it West Canada. Why they just call it the Dominion of Canada, and that those Easterners call themselves the Republic of Canada.
Good. Thanks very much. We'll leave that one alone. That's not capable of being looked after at all, that call. Go ahead, please.
Afraid not.
Yes, I just wanted to say to Doug that everyone calls me a bigot, but I am totally 100% for separatists in the West.
Why?
I am originally from the East.
Apart from perhaps the thing you have about French Canada, what are your other practical reasons?
Well, the way I look at it is, in northern Canada, there's lots of people needed support from the federal government, and yet we bring in people from all over the world. We spend money all over the world to help support other countries, yet the federal government doesn't want to help the Canadians up north.
Well, that's probably true. I don't think they're politically necessary. You see, Western Canada and the North generally don't need to be regarded politically by the federal government. I might
what I
point
would
out
like to
that,
ask is, what will you do? Okay, are you going to recognize the Queen?
We believe in the continuation of the constitutional monarchy. That is, as we regard it, the popular will of the people of Western Canada. We would keep everything that's good about in Canada today, and the opportunity to build it the way it would reflect our interests is really the only significant change.
And you'd remove everything that's bad?
Well, I think we could do a lot better than the government in Ottawa is doing for us.
I have serious doubts whether any government does anything very well today. And that includes the Western provincial governments as well as the federal government with all its deficits.
I agree, there's a dearth of leadership, and the criticisms that are directed against leaders are often justified.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Christie?
Yes, sir.
I choose. Speak up, please.
Hello?
Hello.
Yes. Mr. Christie?
Yes, sir.
With you, 100%. How does one get involved with your organization?
Well, write to me in Victoria, and we'll be glad to help you. And we're going to organize in British Columbia. We've been very busy in Alberta. I've spoken Lethbridge, Calgary, Red Deer, Edmonton, and Winnipeg to packed houses in the last about 20 days. I'm back to British Columbia shortly to build the new national concept of Western Canada here.
Thank you very much. As a matter of fact, though, who would benefit most from the separation of the West from the East?
Westerners.
How about the American oil companies?
Well, we're going to tax according to the fair return that should remain here. We're not going to reduce taxation. We're just going to have the benefit of this revenue remain where the oil comes from, so that when we won't have dry holes in the ground and nothing left, like the gold towns of the Caribou, you know, when the gold was gone, so were the towns.
Common currency?
No. We'll have a Western Canadian dollar backed by the Western Canadian economy.
Free trade?
Yes.
Passports?
Well, yes, probably our own. Yes, that's right.
Own airline?
We don't have to own an airline, but we can certainly service them.
It would be fair to say that you take the exact same cultural and separatist parallels as does your hero René Lévesque.
Well, they have language and culture reasons. We have basic economic reasons, and that's the difference.
You're not concerned with language as long as it's not French.
We don't have to legislate language. The government has no business telling us what language we should speak any more than they tell us what we should say.
And our culture is secure.
We'll have to define it for ourselves. I don't have to tell you what your culture is, you to tell me. We'll live it.
I don't have any culture.
Well, I think you do. I think we all do. I think that Western Canadians are a multicultural society, and it's developing. It takes a long time to build a culture. You don't do it overnight by legislation.
Wish you could tell me how many members you have signed up.
Well, honest, I couldn't. I wouldn't want to be misquoted and be inaccurate. It's over 2,500, and I've worked very hard to build it there, and it's growing every day.
My thanks to Doug Christie. My thanks? Yes, of course,
Careful,
my thanks.
careful.
To Doug Christie of the Western Canada Concept.
Thank you.
We're going to let down a little bit and have a gossip. I've got 3 things to do. A piece on the Nahanni Trailhead and a short piece for Rosemary Brown. Next. What are you making faces about, Fred? My thanks to Christie. After the break.
Thank you, Mr.
Delightful girl here now, Joanne Ronan Moore, and she and her husband have written a book which I've actually read called Nahanni Trailhead, A Year in the Northern Wilderness. Now, when I came out here in the 40s, it was the time of a great expedition by Russ Baker and Pierre Berton, and they flew into the Nahanni, and they came back and they wrote all those fearsome stories about Headless Valley. Now, tell me why you and your husband did this, and how you did it, and when you did it.
Okay, why we did it was we were as familiar about the headless stories in the South Nahanni River as anyone else, and especially a book of Raymond Patterson's, BC author actually, and his Dangerous River describes very vividly that part of the country in 2728, 1900. And John and I were intrigued by his pioneering tale. That, and we knew people were of just running trips in that area. And so we wanted to spend a year in the wilderness. We had read a great deal about that area, and what a perfect place.
You planned it like an expedition to the North Pole, as I recall from the book. You got all your supplies, you ferried them and flew them into a spot. Which spot in the South Nahanni?
We were about 60 miles above Nahanni National Park. Because we were planning to build a cabin, we had to be outside the park.
You were actually outside the park, but there's one story in your book which fascinated me. You're just setting up your cabin, and in flies a government helicopter.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, it's Crown land, and it's being closely watched. There are a number of mining setups in that area as well. And I don't know for what reason those people were in. I believe it was to see us. We had a permit, a government permit, that allowed us to stay there for 1 year. They checked in to see if we'd arrived. We had. They wanted to check our sort of what procedures we were going to follow in keeping the land clean. we discussed that with them.
They went in to check your septic tank. How far were you from civilization?
Well, any small town in actually any direction was 200 miles.
Tell me about the building. You built the cabin in the summer, didn't you?
We did. We arrived June 3rd, had the house built by August 5th.
Weather and animals.
The weather was rainy in June and very hot in July and very buggy, both in June and July. Animal life, at that point in time we were building, we didn't see a great deal. We were making quite a bit of racket in the clearing, and so we frightened some of them away. But the minute the house was built, your standard wilderness crew, grizzlies, wolverines, wolves, moose, black bear, caribou, goats and sheep.
You have great fun. You didn't want to kill any wildlife, did you?
No, we didn't.
What about the time you killed the wolverine?
We were in a situation when he returned.
You said a wolverine's a cross between a wolf and a bear.
That's how I think of them.
They're not quite wolves and they're not quite bears.
Right. He's the size of a bear cub, and he's got some of the quality features of a wolf, sort of the snout, the square front. Just looking at him, that's.
That was once you had settled in and stopped building, though. The wolverines began to come round and just made hay with some of your equipment and snowshoes, did they not?
They did, and anything that had salt on it, it seemed, attracted any animal, wolves as well as wolverines, and so they would just free for all. I mean, they wanted it, they went after it.
And one night, reluctantly, your husband had to shoot the wolverine.
He did.
What about the grizzlies? That's what terrifies me, is the thought of being around a grizzly bear that doesn't like me. And we've had so many horrendous stories from Banff National Park and Lake Louise and the rest of them where people have been eaten.
That's right. It is frightening, and I think those in the national parks are probably more apt to be troubled because they're fed, and that's I think the advantage, if there was one, about being close to wild grizzlies. Just make sure you're not on their path. Make sure you don't surprise them. This was the way we felt about it. We made sure when we were in the bush and in thick bush that we made quite a bit of racket, so as not to sort of frighten one.
Because you only have one 303 Enfield, said he, remembering your vast equipment list at the back of the book. Is that right?
That's right.
Did you have to use it much apart from the wolverine?
The wolverine was the only time that it was necessary to take an animal that wasn't for food. The moose we took for winter meat.
What year was this that you did the Nahanni Trailhead?
June 1978 to June 1979.
So you're just out a little more than a year. How did it change your life, yours and John's lives?
I think that when you undertake any large project and work together at it, I think that that's going to bring you closer as a couple. One of the objectives of the trip was that. Secondly, I think that if you succeed at something that you set as your goal, that definitely affects what you take on later on.
It's a fascinating story. You did a lot of snowshoeing on the higher elevations, and skiing.
Skiing, we're very outdoorsy people, if you want to call us that, and so the more we spent in the mountains, the more we loved it.
I don't recall if you had radio contact with the outside world.
We did. We had a XBX-11A, a very popular two-way radio. You can't always get a signal, bounce a signal off the ionosphere to get out, but it's there.
And in an emergency, you would have managed, if the weather was half decent, to get a signal out.
That's right, if the ionosphere.
And you flew out in June 1979?
We traveled down the South Nahanni River in the spring, and then flew out from Fort Simpson.
Will the mining companies ruin it?
I hope not. I don't think so. I think there's a great deal of respect for that part of the country still.
There are no Indians living in the Nahanni at all?
We didn't see a one.
But you saw lots of tourists coming down and rafting.
In the summer months, it's a popular river.
Did they not help you to build your house?
A group of 12, pre-arranged, did come into the site for a day and help us.
Joanne, I'd like to have given you more time, but we'll give you a good plug for the book, The Nahanni Trailhead. It's a delightful wilderness, frontier, modern pioneer-type years experiment in living in the South Nahanni, 200 miles from anywhere. Thank you very much. When are you going to have the baby?
March.
Hope it's a boy. I'll be back with a whatever after the break. I'm afraid of some MLAs like Rosemary Brown, so I must make room this morning for a piece on the Task Force of Aging Women operated by the NDP. I have a very delicate and dicey and diplomatic interview ahead of me right now because I've been asked to interview a couple of older women in the Task Force on Older Women, sponsored by the Women's Rights Committee of the BC NDP. Let's tackle older woman number one, Marcia Stickney. How old are you, older woman?
I'm 48, Jack.
Oh, dare I ask Rosemary Brown how old she is?
Well, Jack, I'm sure you're the only person in BC who doesn't know that I'm 50 this year because Marjorie Nichols announced it to the whole world in her column on my birthday.
You don't look
the big 50.
You don't look a day more than 29.
Oh, that's not true. I certainly hope I look my age.
My impression when I saw about this task force on older women was that you NDP women were wasting your time in the obvious. Surely it's quite obvious what the problems of older women are.
Is it obvious to you? What are they?
They're getting older.
Ah, but you can get older without having some of the problems that older women are having now.
Oh, nonsense. There's no difference in the problems of aging between men and women. It's a question of you getting older, you lose some of your friends, and you're often far too short of money to do the things you wanted to do when you were younger.
I'm glad you mentioned the money, Jack, because in fact, the statistics, whether it's Senator Crow's report, or the Canadian Council on Social Development, or the Dominion Bureau of Statistics recorded very clearly that most of the poor people in this country are older women. So that is a very great difference between older women and older men.
So therefore this is a task force on the problems of older, poorer women. Is that right?
No, that's just one of the differences. You said there was no difference between older women and older men. And I'm saying that poverty is very clearly one of the differences.
What's the point of your exercise? I mean, you've been holding some public hearings. To what purpose, please, Marcia Stickney?
Excuse me. But our purpose is to raise the issues, to go to the women and have them raise the issues, not somebody telling us as women what our problems are.
Right,
so we're raising the issues.
What issues have they raised with you that are other than common sense issues?
They have raised specific aspects of issues. For instance, the aspect of poverty that Rosemary was talking about, and how older women cannot often stay in their own homes because of the cost of home repairs. Now, they could be getting along quite well on their gain and the old age pension if they own their home and they don't have rent increases. But when it comes to getting home repairs, that means that they have to pay $26 an hour for labor to have a washer repaired in their tap. That's $26 out of their monthly income, which they simply can't afford.
These labor rates are absolutely ridiculous, aren't they?
No,
I think that
it's not that the rates are ridiculous.
The income is low.
Right. It's trying to live on a fixed income and an inadequate income. But there are some other issues too. You know, the whole attitude towards aging. Everyone being so secretive about it. We live in a society in which everyone has to be young, and it's something terrible happens
and
to
slim.
you.
Don't forget the slim.
And slim. Yeah, that's right, Jack. Even you.
And not allowed to smoke.
Well, I don't approve of smoking, but that's okay.
Not allowed to have a drink.
But no, that's allowed. I mean, the biggest pusher of alcohol in the province is the government. So
well, you were part of that, and you've done your share to push alcohol.
You don't want to talk about older women, do you, Jack?
I want to know what the object of the exercise is. Having got your information from women, problems of money, rent, lack of social life. Women live longer than men and therefore are lonelier in the long run than men are. What are you going to do about it?
What we do about it is we have no policy within the party on older women. We want to devise that policy. As the Women's Rights Committee within the party, we fight for that to be a priority in any election program and for it to be a priority for implementation in government. In the meantime, the report that we come out with will contain the information that we've received. It will be available to any community group to use for lobbying purposes. It's available to our caucus members to use for lobbying, to use within the legislature and to pressure the government to make changes. So it's
available to you, Jack, also to use on your show to talk about, for example, the things that that's coming out in housing is that these bachelor suites, over and over, everywhere we go, the women are saying, we loathe these things. We do not like having to spend the rest of our lives in one room. Now, that's something I think when we talk about building public housing, that politicians and architects and bureaucrats have to take into account.
What would you suggest, communal living for older widows?
Well, there's got to be an alternative to bachelor suites. If we start looking at it, maybe cooperative living, maybe some other way of dividing the space. I don't know, but these are
I don't think old people
of...
want to live together, getting there myself. You want to live in a community with younger people, surely.
Nobody, I think, has ever asked older people and older women about what they wanted and how they experienced it. So I think that architects were unaware of the fact that to live 20 years in one room and in essence to die from that room is just too much to ask of any human being.
The other point, Jack, that's coming out is the business of, the overuse of drugs. They're saying doesn't matter what complaints they go to the doctor with, they get a prescription either for something to calm them or something to raise, either uppers or downers or whatever. And this overuse of drugs, they're saying it's just not good enough.
And I'll give you a little piece of testimony involving one particular older woman. Her husband was 78, went into Valley View, and she was shattered and shocked to find out that suddenly he was given psychiatric treatment. And she was called into a family conference and told that she was to blame, that she had pampered her elderly husband too much. That might be something. The techniques for dealing with old people and what they think is an old folks' home might well be examined.
See, there you are. You already are beginning to make a contribution to the task force on older women.
When will your report be finished, ladies? Women. I can't call you ladies. Women.
That's correct.
Persons.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that we are going to be holding a public hearing this Saturday at the YWCA on Burrard.
In Vancouver.
In Vancouver, starting at 9:15
My thanks to Master Stickney of the NDP Women's Rights Committee. And your name again? I keep forgetting.
Rosemary Brown, 50-year-old.
Still NDP?
Oh, always.
Going to run the next election?
Yes, Jack, have to.
The public session of the task force is at downtown YWCA Saturday, lunch provided to all women who attend. I'll be back after the break. That one, no. Tomorrow is?
Monique Bejan, a Liberal, and Jack Horner, a sometime Liberal.
Tomorrow is Thursday.
Yes.
Monique Bejan, the Minister of Health, emotional, bright. We've got to say about the doctors opting out. Tomorrow's Friday. Tomorrow's not.
Oh, well, those are the same people we're having.
Monique Bejan, Jack Horner.
Whether it's Thursday or Friday, it's
Jack
those people.
Horner's coming out of his little corner with the inside story about little Jack Horner at 9 a.m. precisely.